Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath. The Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defence, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at work to this very day, and so I am working." For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus gave them this answer: "Very truly I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can do only what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all may honour the Son just as they honour the Father. Whoever does not honour the Son does not honour the Father who sent him. Very truly I tell you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but is crossed over from death to life. Very truly I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to judge, because he is the Son of Man. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. By myself I can do nothing. I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just, for I seek not to please myself, but him who sent me. If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. There is another who testifies in my favour, and I know that his testimony about me is true. You have sent to John, and he has testified to the truth. Not that I accept human testimony, but I mention it that you may be saved. John was a lamp that burned and gave light, and you chose for a time to enjoy his light. I have testimony weightier than that of John. For the works that the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I am doing, testify that the Father has sent me. And the Father who sent me has himself testified concerning me. You have never heard his voice nor seen his form, nor does his word dwell in you, for you do not believe the one he sent. You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life. I do not accept glory from human beings, but I know you. I know that you do not have the love of God in your hearts. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not accept me. But if someone else comes in his name, you will accept him. How can you believe since you accept glory from one another, but do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? But do not think I will accuse you before the Father. Your accuser is Moses, on whom your hopes are set. If you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say?
Well, there's a famous statement. C.S. Lewis, who many of you will know because of the Chronicles of Narnia, Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and all that, he also made a statement about, he wrote a lot of stuff about Christian faith. And he said this at one point. It's often called the trilemma. So some of you will know this pretty well. He says, I'm trying to prevent here anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, that I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would be either a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit on him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let's not come with any of that patronising nonsense about him being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now, Lewis said that in the 40s, during the war, actually the Second World War, he was giving a series of radio broadcasts in Britain to explain the basics of what Christianity was about. And that became his book, Mere Christianity. It was edited into that, so it's well worth a read if you never have. But he's talking into a time and a place where it's not unlike our own. People thought Jesus to be a very compelling figure, a figure worth knowing something of, someone that they admired. But the idea that he could be more than just another man, the idea that he could be God among us, was a crazy thought to so many people. They didn't want to believe in that. And no doubt, it's a big claim, isn't it? You can kind of see why people would want to diminish the person of Jesus. Because if Jesus is who he said he is, then we can't pick and choose from what he says, of what we like. We're not free to decide which of his teachings we want to follow. Where it's not up to us to sort of stand there looking at him and thinking, well, this is old-fashioned, or this is what we believe. Or actually, we have to start accepting everything he says, don't we? If this is God among us, then it doesn't matter how uncomfortable or costly it is personally, we actually have to follow him wholeheartedly. And so you can see why the idea of just another moral teacher is so appealing. Because if I threw a name like a Plato or an Aristotle at you, great teachers, brilliant minds, smarter than any of us, but hardly binding. None of us worry about what they say. So Jesus is a confronting figure. Now, in these verses, what we actually get from Jesus is some of the clearest claims to who he is that you will find on his lips. And so they're really worth our thinking about. Because if we're going to make the claim that he's either someone that we need to follow absolutely or totally discard, we need to wrestle with this question, who actually is this man? So a reminder of the setting, where are we? Last week we looked at the first half of the chapter, or the first section, with that healing. There's the lame man at the pool of Bethsaida who Jesus healed. Now Jesus at this point, it's within the context of a festival. Jesus is in Jerusalem. There is a festival going on. Which festival? Don't know. There were 3 festivals that all the Jewish men were expected to go to each year, if they were able. There was the Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So it's probably one of them. And as a bit of a side note, it's just of interest rather than of great importance. You often hear that Jesus had 3 years of public ministry. That idea comes entirely from John mentioning the Passover 3 times in 2:13, 6:4 and 12:1. If this is another Passover that's just not labelled as such, then maybe that's a 4th year of ministry or whatever. But that, as I said, is more of a passing interest. The main point is that at these festivals, you have people descending on Jerusalem, expectant of meeting God in some sense. And we might think of it as somewhat analogous to our Christmas or our Easter services, where Christian people maybe go to extra efforts to dwell on the things of God, and where people who might not ever want to darken our doors do come in and do want to think about these things. So it's a moment of expectation, a moment of eagerness, where people come to really approach God in a particular manner. And in the midst of that, does God show up? Well, he does, doesn't he? Because we find Jesus in this pool, picking out this one man and healing him. A lame man for 38 years is told, get up, take your mat and walk. And he does. But he does it only for Jesus to then very quickly sort of scoot away before anyone, even before the man who he healed, had any idea who he was, only for him to then sort of track him down later in the temple courts and say, you're well, brilliant, well now stop sinning or something worse will happen to you. So Jesus has healed him in order that he'll be holy, in order that he'll follow him, not just for the sake of his health. And this whole situation, which we probably read and marvel at, and we think, how could the guy do this kind of amazing thing? And wouldn't it be amazing to be there and see it? And I'd never doubt Jesus again if I could just see him do this kind of thing. Well, what did the leaders do? This bloke, he finds out who healed him, and he he runs off and he dobs on Jesus, dobs him into the authorities, who then come and confront him. And they confront him because both Jesus, in healing on the Sabbath, and this other man, for picking up his mat and walking with it on the Sabbath, have broken some very important oral traditions around the fourth commandment in terms of what is work and what is forbidden on this day of rest. And so they confront him. Who do you think you are? Who does this man think he is? He knows what the scriptures say. He knows the traditions of our elders. Who does he think he is healing on the Sabbath? Who does he think he is making this man pick up his mat and walk on this day? And Jesus' answer will be to say, I am God among you. Right? If you want to know my authority, if you want to know why I'm able to do these things, it is because I am God who has come among you. Now you might reply, having read this, that you don't see those words. And you're right, you don't see those words. In fact, I remember a Muslim guy that I was discussing with these things. And if you know about Islam, they believe in Jesus as a great prophet, but they reject the idea that he's God in the flesh, which is a big difference between our faith and theirs. And this guy was saying, tell me, where did Jesus ever claim? Show me where Jesus ever said, I am God. And you have to concede, Jesus never says those words. But of course, as we know, the lack of a particular phrase doesn't mean that the idea is not there and being communicated. And that's exactly what Jesus will do. And you can see his answer is to say to them, my Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working, down there in verse 17. So his answer, my Father's at work, that's why I'm at work. And we might miss the significance of it because we're not culturally in the space that they were. But there's no one in this story, not Jesus, not the Jews, not John as he watches on, who misses the implication of what he's saying, is there? This guy's making himself equal with the Father. They want to kill him for that reason. Now they're not just wanting to kill him because he's breaking the Sabbath, but now he's making himself equal with God. And the same thing happens elsewhere in John. You can look at 10:33 and 19:7 for the same thing to happen. Now we need to understand this is where their mind is at. In fact, good old Craig Barker, where is he? Sitting somewhere. He told me of an experience a couple of times where when he first arrived in Australia as a young guy from New Zealand, someone had told him about how he was wearing thongs. And being from New Zealand, apparently they call them jangles or something over there. An equally ridiculous sort of Kiwi name. But Craig, having never heard the word thongs in terms of, we think of footwear, he'd only ever heard them in terms of a particularly skimpy piece of underwear. He was very, very confronted that someone was sharing such an intimate detail with him as a young bloke. Of course, if you asked him now, if you talk to him now that he's been in the country and he's learnt the lingo a little bit more, you would find that if you said, I'm going home to put my thongs on, he would very quickly look at your feet and say, it's a bit cold for that, isn't it? He would know what you're talking about. Right? We've got to get ourselves in the cultural space. We've got to understand the people on their terms. And even if Jesus doesn't use the particular phrase we want, no one there doubted what he said. No one is doubting it. This is a bunch of people who have, from the moment they're born, drilled into them, there is one God and one God alone. He alone is worthy of worship. He alone is allowed to do what he wants. God will not share his glory with anyone else. He has no equal. And that's where their mind is at. Rightly so. That's a good thing to believe. And here is Jesus saying, I work on the Sabbath. Why? Well, why wouldn't I? My Father's at work, and so am I. He's saying I can do what only God can do. And they see it straight away as a claim that he is equal with God. But it's not even just in the Sabbath. You can see it, a whole range of things Jesus says he does that are things in the Old Testament that are rightly only attributed to God. And so, for example, as we said, the Son does as the Father does, but there's a repetition. John has a lot of words, but he repeats concepts again and again. So you can see it there in verse, he gives life and raises the dead, Jesus does. Verse 21, then again in 24 to 26, then again in 28. Right? Jesus can give life. Jesus judges, verse 22, 27, and then 30. Maybe most shockingly to these people, Jesus says quite rightly in verse 23 that he is rightly given glory and worship. And you think of Philippians 2, right? That's where history is heading. Every knee will bow, every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. We will all bow before him in worship and adoration. Now here's the thing, if I told you that I could give you life, if I told you that I could either condemn you to hell or promise you heaven, and if I told you you should bow down and worship me, you'd at very least look at me like I was purple. More likely, you'd keep me right away from your kids or anyone else that you wanted to know the truth. I would be dangerous, I'd be blasphemous, I'd be all kinds of things, wouldn't I? It's not right for any man to claim these things. And it's not right for Jesus to claim these things. He would be an absolute megalomaniac unless he really is who he says he is. Jesus was just another man. This stuff is crazy. But if Jesus is God among us, that changes everything. And so the Jews know this. They want to kill him. And whether they're right or wrong depends on who Jesus actually is. Now at this point, Jesus wants to point them to the fact that they actually should know. And we should know, but they should know. And you can see a whole bunch of stuff from 31 and following, the witnesses to Jesus. Yeah, he says, don't just take my word for it. If I testify about myself, that's not counting. But look at what the Father has testified. And you can see in verse 32 what he says, another who testifies for me, is kind of clarified down in verse 37, that it's the Father who sent me himself testifies concerning me. Right? So this is God the Father testifying. How does he testify? A whole range of ways. Verse 33 through John the Baptist, who came into the world, who they went to and said, you're obviously someone important, who are you? He said, well, I'm not the Christ, but he's coming. And later he can point to Jesus. So they have the testimony of God's great prophet, John the Baptist. Then Jesus says in verse 36, look at his own works. Look at the things he's doing. And we're only a short way into the gospel, really, in the scheme of things. We're only, less than a third of the way through. Already he's turned water into wine. He's made lame men walk. He's raised sick children up from their deathbed. He's done all these amazing things. And as we read on, we're going to see him do plenty more amazing things, everything up to even raising the very dead. And the point is, they're looking at these things, and they should have known. In the Old Testament, these miracles always seem to follow around God's messenger. They're not just arbitrary. They're not just things that happen. And you think of Nicodemus when he comes to Jesus, says, well, we know you must be from God in some way, because no one could do the things you're doing if they weren't. So they get that these miracles are supposed to authenticate his message, and yet when he speaks the message, despite the amazing things he's doing, they go, well, we don't believe that. They still think he's blaspheming. 39 and 40, the scriptures, the Old Testament spoke of Jesus. And these were guys who knew it back to front. Now, if you want to understand the level of knowledge these guys had, take all the little numbers out of your Bible. What they would actually do is copy it down in the same manner, and they would know where to pinpoint a verse by the first couple of words. So you think of Genesis, it's just the word for beginning. And if you said to them in the beginning in Hebrew, they would know exactly where to go, Genesis 1:1, and they could do that across the Bible. And yet despite that level of knowledge up here, they'd missed the point. Because actually these scriptures were supposed to tell them about Christ when he came. And when he comes, they don't recognise him. And then finally, if that wasn't enough, you can see in verse 46, even Moses. Moses, who through whom God gives the first 5 books of the Old Testament, what we would think of as the law. Well, these people had read that, they know it, they're putting their trust in it. Again, was supposed to prepare them for the coming of the Messiah, of the Christ. And what do? They see the Messiah show up and they reject him. So they put their hope in Moses and the law rather than in the Messiah that Moses was really talking about. And Jesus is pulling all these things together and saying, guys, you've had plenty of witness. It's not like God's left you without plenty of signs about who I am. Why don't you get it? Why don't you get it? Why don't they see that he's more than just another bloke wandering around attracting a few followers? Right? And if you really knew the Word of God, he says, if you really paid attention to what God was saying, you would know that I'm the one who it was all about, and you would receive me just as you should receive the Father. And of course, we know the end of the story. We know that they weren't convinced, they didn't believe in him suddenly, and they would continue to doubt him until they'd nailed him to a cross. But there are huge implications for us if we dwell on this truth, right? Because hopefully you can see, for all the words, all the repetition, everything that Jesus says, his message is actually pretty simple, isn't it? He says, I can do what only God can do because I'm God among you, and look at all the ways God has shown you that that's true. That's the guts of what he says. And I want to suggest, hopefully we can see that for that, it's an equally simple message in the sense that it's easy to grasp, but there's nothing harder for us to do than to throw ourselves at his feet, because it's challenging, because it's all-encompassing what he actually wants from us. You see, we've got plenty of testimony. You've got the scriptures. We have Bibles that we can read. We can see what God has done and is doing in the world. We can hear from those who were there when Jesus rose from the dead and wrote their testimony down. We can see the way that message has spread and changed millions upon millions of lives. There's plenty that we can see that says this Jesus guy is not just an ordinary bloke, not even a very special guy. There's something about him that is just so different. And C.S. Lewis was right, when he said, even if we just take this one passage and this one alone, where Jesus makes himself totally equal with God, or if we think he's just a curiosity, a significant but ultimately ordinary bloke, or a good teacher that we can sift through his stuff and figure out what stands up to our modern ideas, or if we think he's just a dispenser of good things in times of need, well, we've actually missed the point. If he was any of those things and he said the things that he said, he would either be the greatest liar or the greatest charlatan in history. But if he really is who he says he is, then that changes everything. Now, all that he says matters enormously, and our response to him matters enormously. In fact, nothing could be more right for us, more important for us than getting our picture of who Christ is correct. Nothing. Because all the great moral teaching, all the wonderful promises, all the great meaning and purpose he gives to your life, they're secondary things. They only matter if Jesus really is who he says he is. And if he is God among us, then all those other things not only matter, but take on a fullness and a meaning that maybe we haven't even realised. A depth, we'll spend the rest of our lives plumbing the depths of what that actually means. Everything else flows from that one idea. Is Jesus really the God who's come and stepped down among us in human flesh? Is he who he says he is? Now, as I say all this, I guess I say it as someone who, this truth means a lot to me, in part just because of personal experience, I guess. I'm someone who, like many of you, grew up in church, had parents who went to fair efforts to make sure I understood the teaching of Christ and understood the gospel. If you'd come into my scripture class when I was a little kid, I probably knew more answers than anyone else, and Sunday school and all that kind of stuff. That was all true. And yet, the reality was that despite that, I, for a fair chunk of my life, treated Jesus as if he was functionally sort of secondary, if that makes sense. As if I didn't really believe these things, and as if I could stand over him. And I mean that because you never would have found me claiming to be anything other than a Christian, but then there were plenty of times where I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew what Jesus would have had me do, and they were in conflict. And whose will do you think I submitted to? It often wasn't Jesus. It was doing things my way, picking and choosing him. Great teacher, wonderful guy, but someone who I treated as if I could pick and choose. Now, I wouldn't have told you I was doing that. I wouldn't have grasped that idea at that point. Except for in maybe some of my more honest moments where those things did torment me, and I knew that was a reality. But I'll never forget when that changed, because it was actually when we went to do our marriage prep, Jenna and I, and for the first time in, 7, 8 years, I guess, I sat down and I opened a Bible. And in fact, I opened to Mark. Christianity Explored, which many of you will be familiar with, was the course we were doing. And Mark, if you know Mark, is just this action-packed gospel where just Jesus, bang, 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 constantly action of things that he's doing and teaching and saying, and amazing stuff going on. So 1 minute he's healing a guy, then he's driving out a demon, and then he's teaching him with such authority that everybody just hangs off his every word. Then he's calming a storm, then he's feeding a multitude. And it's just this constant thing where you're confronted every turn with the fact that this guy, there's not a single inch of the creation that he has not, at a word, got absolute authority over. And in that moment, I have to say my heart was warmed. And it was warm despite the fact that I read that knowing full well that I'd been not treating this guy as I should. And that everything in my life said the opposite, or said I believed the opposite of what I was reading and would have told you I believed. I'll tell you why it warmed my heart. Because as much as I was confronted with that, not only was Jesus compelling, but I noticed everyone who came to him with all their messiness and all that was wrong with them, when they actually did submit to him, those that left him left far better off, healed, forgiven, whatever it might be. It was only those who refused to submit to him that left sad. You saw someone who used his authority with incredible mercy, and ultimately a mercy that drove him to give his life to bring sinners back to him. And I think noticing that, I can't tell you the peace, I guess, that I felt instantly, despite all that was still very much wrong and still is wrong in my life now. There was an incredible peace, and I can't tell you how much better life became just from submitting to his lordship. And so really my question, with all that we've said, Jesus' message is clear. But we know the demands are huge, that it can be a very hard, very costly thing. Where do you stand? What have you made of who this guy is? Is he just another guy who you admire, who maybe you have a lot to learn from, but ultimately just another person? Or is he the God who came among us? And have you submitted yourself to the awesome authority of that one? Do you know the forgiveness and the lordship that he holds out?